Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 26, Changeling Anonymous. Nanoseconds after clicking on their links, Sophie, Clara and Kingsley were dropped into a wide open field. Dominating the field was a huge, neon blue, oval-shaped beam of light, which Sophie immediately thought to be some kind of doorway or portal. It stood about the size of a house and hovered slightly above the floor. Pulsating beams shook all around it, and the occasional flash of blue was emitted out of it. "What is that?" Clara asked, mouth as wide open as the portal. Sophie didn't, or rather couldn't answer. Dancing across the sky were more blue blasts, like the portal was controlling all around it. The sky shook and the ground trembled as the portal seemed to get angrier and angrier. It dawned on Sophie that it was about 2 p.m, and because they were still in England, it should still be daytime. However, the sky was darker than it had ever been at night. No stars glistened, and there was no moon to provide even the slightest hint of brightness. All the light was coming from the portal, and that was more eerie to the three children. Sophie felt a tug on her sleeve. It was Clara again, pointing away from the portal at a humongous group of figures gathered in a large cluster, some way away from the dominant light source. In the centre of them was the unmistakable figure of Desmeralda, still in her freakish changeling form that Sophie had seen when she'd grabbed her arm on the first day they'd met. Before she could study more carefully, Sophie just managed to keep a shriek in as the loudest clap of thunder she had ever heard in her life reverberated violently all around them. "I don't like this," Sophie finally admitted. Clara again pointed at the group of figures, reminding Sophie of what she'd been doing before she jumped out of her skin. Initially, Sophie thought that the group surrounding Desmeralda were all changelings, but on closer inspection, it became clear that there were many other species present. Straight away, it started to remind her of when they'd arrived in Zatvor and saw all of the creatures that she'd read about with her dad over the years. This time, it was different though. There wasn't a menacing air about the group. Sophie couldn't sense any danger or tension about them. The atmosphere was nervous, but almost friendly. No one was out to do anyone any harm, which caught Sophie off guard. It made her want to relax. Then, the enormous portal erupted again. It sent lightning more bolts into the sky and caused the ground to shake. All of a sudden, Sophie was reminded that she shouldn't get pulled into what appeared to be a welcoming atmosphere amongst the newly resurfaced mythicals, just in case she misread the whole thing. Kingsley had gone back to not talking much. However, even in these very unfamiliar surroundings, he didn't seem at all fazed, just focused. As the three watched on from what they deemed a safe distance, more and more figures began materialising all over the field and started making their way over to the group. There were different creatures of all shapes and sizes. A family of fawns galloped past, accompanied by a changeling who had clearly teleported them there. 2 elves, who were holding hands and joking with each other, then walked slowly past the other side of the 3 children. Behind them was a changeling, who the elves turned and thanked for teleporting them there. "What is this?" Clara asked. "I was expecting hundreds of changelings preparing to do battle, not hundreds of everything else looking nervous." "I have no idea," Sophie replied, still not taking her eyes off the group. "I don't think this is dangerous," Kingsley finally spoke. "Nor do I," Sophie replied. "Until we know what's going on, you're not going to talk to any of them," came Miss Sisson's voice in their ears. "But they're all families," Sophie argued as a group of 6 hippogriffs, 2 adults, 4 children, galloped past towards Desmeralda, also thanking a changeling behind them. "There are creatures with very dangerous powers in that group. You are not permitted to talk to them, as who knows what they will try and do to a group of human children," Miss Sissons added. "You let us do it in Zatvor," Clara abruptly responded, pointing out the flaw in what Miss Sissons had just said. "We were working against the clock then," Miss Sissons argued. "If all these creatures are friendly like you say, then there's no rush here. Also, if you alert Desmeralda to your location, then we have no idea what she will do to the planet or all the children on it. For all we know, this is still an attack." Suddenly, an idea hit Sophie and she stopped dead in her tracks. "Can't you change our appearance?" she asked Miss Sissons, remembering that time at Scope when she had turned into her mum and Dale Nathan. "That way, we could just stand in and around them and they would have no idea who we were." Well, they won't pick you up anyway, because we've seen that they can't do anything to your avatars. Sophie and Clara tutted and rolled their eyes, as Miss Sissons had just pointed out the obvious. But I suppose it might help. Hold on, Miss Sissons said in their ears. You're going to disguise us as changelings? Clara asked. Brilliant. We're going to look like that? Kingsley asked, pointing at one of the green-hooded monstrosities his mum was talking to, looking decidedly unimpressed. A few seconds later, and Miss Sissons was back on the radio. Right, I can't change it fully for long because you need the actual equipment on your actual body and you're in your avatar forms, but I can tweak them a bit. Go for it, Sophie said. The three stood looking at each other and the transformations began. Clara's skin turned green and her nose stuck out. A wart appeared on the tip of her chin and scratches ran down her cheeks. Quite a lot of Kingsley's hair simply vanished, and he was left with clumps in random places on his head, coupled with his skin also turning a slightly darker shade of blue than it normally did when he turned changeling, and he was as good as unrecognisable. Sophie reached up and touched her own face and head. Her hair had almost completely gone, and her face was no longer smooth. It was coated in bobbles and lumps that Sophie assumed were warts similar to Clara's. Annoyingly, they still had their school uniforms on, but they were now all ripped and torn and would certainly have gotten them a telling off from both teachers and parents if they were to set eyes on them. Almost in unison, the three began to giggle, but quickly remembered where they were as the portal let out another eruption and brought them back under control. I can change back afterwards, can't I? Kingsley asked. No idea, replied Clara, without even looking at him. She was still too busy assessing the state of her clothes. Sophie noticed that the number of changelings and other creatures that had been flowing past them had started to drop. She assumed they were all now transformed and were almost all present and correct, as it were. How many is there? She asked Miss Sissons. Knowing Miss Sissons would count up the dots on her scanner, Sophie gave her a second. In the meantime, a figure appeared right in front of them, with its back to them. The figure was clearly a changeling, as she had random strands of long green hair protruding out of an otherwise bald head. The head itself had cuts and trickles of blood running down it. Before Sophie could analyse any more, the figure span round to look at them, and the three of them were greeted with the most revolting yet enthusiastic smile they had ever seen. Teeth were missing. A green tongue flapped around inside the mouth, and eyebrows that almost covered the person's eyes. Even the most horrific face that stood in front of them couldn't very well disguise the owner of the smile, though. Yaz? Sophie and Clara both said in unison. Yeah, this is amazing, Yasmin replied, almost pirouetting to get a good look at herself. You're supposed to be at school keeping us out of trouble, Sophie said through what gritted teeth she had left. Mrs. Jones has sent me to another class to make sure you're there. I managed to convince her that Sophie had just followed Clara and not that she'd run off somewhere as she thought. I decided it would sound better than the truth. Sophie then noticed that Yasmin could also get away with lying due to her good reputation as well. So what are we doing exactly? Yasmin asked. Trying to get closer to that, Clara replied, pointing at the huge group of creatures that had now gathered. And trying to avoid that, Sophie added, pointing at the portal. Any moment now, that could be filled with human children being spirited away to the underworld, Sophie said, deadly serious. Yasmin turned and let out a little shriek. Well, come on then. We can't stand here talking all day, can we? She said, hastily pulling herself together. Sophie rolled her eyes, but smiled all the same. It was good to have the three of them together in this, as it calmed her slightly and let her know that she wasn't on her own. About 10 metres away from the back of the group, the four of them stopped and listened to what Desmeralda was saying.